An aircraft carrier provides a very small landing area and very little room for mistakes. A carrier landing is basically a controlled collision between your aircraft and the carrier deck. The proper execution of glide slope, lineup, and angle of attack procedures for a carrier landing are similar to the procedures used in airstrip landings. Despite the similarities, smooth and timely corrections become even more critical for carrier landings. As we progress through this section, you'll recognize terms and procedures from the airstrip landing training. The basics don't change, but now we expand on them to meet the special requirements for carrier operations. We'll go over the landing aids such as the Fresnel lens system and get you on deck in good form to catch a wire. Deck procedures will prepare you for another sortie so you can taxi to the catapult and get back into action. We will discuss the execution of patterns that place you in the proper landing configuration and go over how to deal with the emergencies that might arise in carrier landing situations. Back in World War II, aircraft carriers launched and recovered aircraft in the same direction. It became apparent that the carrier could launch and recover aircraft simultaneously if the aircraft landing area were angled in relation to the ship's heading. The direction your aircraft is launched off the bow is called the base recovery course. Since the landing area is angled, the landing heading will not be the same as the base recovery course. To find the actual landing heading, you must subtract 10 degrees from the ship's heading. The base recovery course for this training session is 360 degrees, making the angled deck landing heading 350 degrees. The carrier ILS shows deviation from the landing heading. Your target touchdown point is the number 3 arresting wire, the origin of the carrier's glide slope. It is critical for you to maintain glide slope all the way to touchdown. 1 foot deviation high or low will result in the hook point of your aircraft touching down 20 feet long or short. Landing long, you could miss all the wires. This is called a bolter. If you are low, you'll land short of the landing area, possibly impacting the back of the boat. This is known as a ramp strike. With only 47 feet between wires, there is very little margin for error. Controlling AOA deviation is critical in preventing the aircraft from getting too slow, causing the angle of attack to increase. Adding power once the engines have rolled back and your aircraft is slow will have little effect since engines take time to spool up. The approach to the ship, or boat, is much the same as an approach to an airfield. It is important to be on glide slope, lineup, and speed. Use the ILS to align yourself in the groove. Once in the groove, you'll utilize 2 additional landing aids, the Fresnel lens system, affectionately called the meatball or just ball, and the landing signal officer, or LSO, who's responsible for assisting the pilot in landing. We'll cover the meatball in more detail in the next topic. At 4 miles out, on a straight-in approach, slow to just 250 knots. Transition to landing configuration and perform your landing checklist. Radar altitude is displayed on the HUD. Gear and flaps are down, ILS is on, and most important, hook is deployed. The hook deployment is operated by pressing the H key. Once deployed, an indicator light located on the instrument panel just above the brake light indicator will come on. The aircraft will not be able to recover on board the boat without the tail hook in the down position. After you're in the landing configuration, call the tower with Shift T. Set throttles to somewhere around 70% RPM initially. Correct your aircraft using the ILS needles, as close as possible to an on and on state by the time you're 3/4 of a mile out. When you're able to make out the ship's landing area, center the velocity vector on the deck parallel with the green datum lights on the meatball. You may still need to correct for glide slope and lineup deviations, but once you are on, recenter the velocity vector and hold it there. Scan the ILS needles and your angle of attack, correcting as necessary. Look for the meatball on the left side of the ship parallel with the middle of the landing area. At 3/4 of a mile, with the ball in sight, contact the LSO and call the ball by pressing Shift L. The Fresnel lens system, or meatball, is a visual landing aid on the aircraft carrier. The meatball provides glide slope information similar to a VASI, but with increased accuracy. It is positioned on the left side of the ship in about the middle of the landing area, facing the final approach course. When entering the groove, each aircraft is required to call the ball to indicate they have sight of it. Call the ball when you're about 3/4 of a mile out by pressing Shift L. The meet ball informs you of the position and the relative movement of your aircraft in relation to the glide slope. If your aircraft is on glide slope, you'll see a centered ball, which means the cell aligned with the datum will be lit. As your aircraft moves to a position higher than the glide slope, a cell above the datum will be seen, giving the effect of a ball moving upwards. If your aircraft moves to a position below glide slope, the meet ball will appear to move below the datum. Correct so you are on glide slope, causing vertical movement of the ball to stabilize. As you approach touchdown, the ball will get much more sensitive. Once you pass over the ramp of the boat, don't chase the ball. Chasing a descending ball in close can result in an extremely hard landing. Hold your attitude and angle of attack to touchdown. The ILS deviates as your aircraft nears the ship. Since the meet ball is projected from the deck directly in line with the landing area, it is more precise. The meet ball has no moving parts and functions no matter what malfunctions or battle damage the aircraft carrier may have. Practice flying the ball with early, small corrections, and remember, don't chase the ball in close. At 3/4 of a mile from the carrier, you are on final approach. Contact the LSO by pressing Shift L. The LSO rogers your call and assists in evaluating your aircraft position relative to lineup, glide slope, and angle of attack. If the deck is fouled with another aircraft, or if your arresting gear is not set, the LSO will give a wave off. If you receive a wave off, add power and take it around, as described in the carrier pattern section. Otherwise, continue your approach, scan the ball, and check lineup and angle of attack. If you see the ball start to get high, correct with a little forward stick and power off. As the ball settles back to glide slope, add power and recenter the velocity vector on the landing area. Make smooth, timely corrections all the way to touchdown. Fly the aircraft right onto the deck. Do not try to flare. Avoid chasing the ball once you're over the ramp. As you fly down onto the deck, keep scanning the meet ball, lineup, and angle of attack. The ball will move rapidly. Try to avoid large corrections. Keep the velocity vector at 4 degrees down in the HUD and centered in the landing area. Once you are over the ramp, fly the aircraft to touchdown without chasing the ball. Apply slight forward stick as you touch down and keep the nose on deck, and punch in 100% power with the delete or backspace key, just in case you don't catch a wire. Leave the power at 100% until your airspeed drops rapidly, then reduce the power to slightly above idle. If your hook misses all the wires or you land long, you'll have to take off again and bring it around for another attempt. Missing the wires is called a bolter. Once you realize the aircraft is boltered, the most important factor is stopping your sink rate. Strong backstick can actually be detrimental. Instead, add power, hold on-speed angle of attack by slowly adding backstick, and let the aircraft fly away. As your speed increases, add more backstick, keeping the center AOA indexer ball lit. Once safely away from the water, reduce power and maneuver the aircraft into the carrier pattern, as described in the carrier pattern section. Once on the deck, you may end the mission by reducing power below 60% or rearm and refuel by pressing Shift S. Raise the tail hook up to taxi. Apply and lock the brakes with the space bar and press the H key to lift the hook. Release the brake and steer to the catapult. Add power as required, but keep it slow and under control at all times. Head for the bow catapult for launch. Position your aircraft over the near end of the left catapult and lock the brake using the space bar. If your position and alignment are correct, the L bar light will illuminate just below the brake light. This signifies that your launch bar is locked into the catapult shuttle and you can begin going through your checklist for takeoff. If the L bar light did not come on, release the brake and move slightly forward or to one side or the other and reapply the brake. When the L bar indicator lights, you are set for launch. Be prepared for launch because by the time you reach the end of the deck, the catapult will have you going about 150 knots. Let's go through the checklist. Brakes on, flaps down, hook up, stick centered, spool the engines to 100%. When ready to launch, go to full afterburner and release the brake. At the end of the catapult stroke, pull smoothly back on the stick to put the waterline mark at 8 degrees nose up. Turn off afterburners and raise the gear and flaps. Now fly the velocity vector keeping a 10-degree climb until 300 to 350 knots is reached. Then increase your rate of climb to hold 300 plus knots. If you are entering the carrier pattern, you will only need to climb to 600 feet, and you can reduce to a pattern speed of 200 to 250 knots. Use the radar altimeter mode selected by pressing Ctrl A anytime you're flying in pattern. Entering the pattern, climb to 600 feet AGL upwind. Anywhere from 1 to 4 miles ahead of the ship, execute a 1.5 to 2G turn to a downwind heading. At this point, your airspeed should be 200 to 250 knots. Prepare for landing with gear, flaps, and hook down. The downwind leg should be flown 3 miles abeam of the ship. You should begin to slow to on speed as you pass the ship. Fly the downwind heading at 600 feet for 20 seconds, slowing to on speed. Then start your crosswind turn into the groove. Descent rate should be approximately 100 feet per minute. Remember, your heading in the groove will be 10 degrees left of the base recovery course. As your turn approaches the 90-degree position, the aircraft should be about 450 feet. Once past the 90, increase your rate of descent by dropping your velocity vector from 1 to 2 degrees down. At the 45, you should see about 450 feet per minute rate of descent. Roll out to intercept glide slope, on landing heading, on speed, with 700 to 800 foot per minute descent rate. Watch for the ball. As soon as you see it, start to correct to achieve a centered ball at 3/4 of a mile out. With the meatball in sight, call the ball by pressing Shift L. Fly into the groove, double check gear, flaps, and hook down. Fly the meatball, line up, and AOA to touchdown. If you have trouble entering the groove in a reasonable shape to land, keep practicing. Carrier landings are very difficult to master. Try using the ILS as you turn into the crosswind. Once in the groove, transition to flying the ball. You may encounter some emergency conditions that require special handling around the carrier. Most emergencies cannot be simulated during training. Skill and experience may be the only hope in getting a crippled aircraft safely aboard. One that can be simulated is a no-HUD carrier landing. Before you turn off the HUD, notice 3 to 4 degrees down is about even with the bottom of the angle of attack indexer. This is the position you want to keep the landing area in during the entire approach. Without a HUD or in any other emergency condition, you'll want to perform a straight-in approach. You can use the navigation display in the HSD to read out aircraft heading. We'll discuss HSD in greater detail in the next section. Since we cannot see details on the carrier itself yet, keep the carrier even with the bottom of the indexer and centered on the HUD. Reduce power until you're on speed. Drop the gear, flaps, and hook. Use small corrections keeping the carrier centered and slightly down on the HUD. Check your landing heading against the wake of the ship. If it's pointing down and slightly left, you're on the correct heading. Correct for lineup if required. As details of the carrier become visible, look for the ball. Once you have sight of the ball, call the ball and correct for glide slope deviations. Do not let the aircraft get too out of shape. Watch your angle of attack and remain on speed. Center the landing area in the HUD even with the bottom of the indexer and fly the aircraft to touchdown. With an instrumentation, flight control, hydraulic, or engine problem, you should attempt to divert to a secondary airfield. If one is not available or fuel does not permit, then you must attempt to either land at the carrier or if the aircraft is not controllable at landing speeds, execute a controlled ejection. If you must eject, establish yourself on an inbound heading to the ship. Descend to approximately 1,000 feet and fly over the ship. Once past the ship, press Shift E to eject from the aircraft. You should be in friendly territory, so it's very likely you'll be safely rescued.